Simone van der Burg. She's a program leader and senior researcher in ethics and responsible research and innovation at Wageningen. Economic research, sorry. And her goal is to contribute to the shaping of research and innovation by enhancing the ethical reflection of stakeholders on the anticipated impacts on social life of research.
So this is about trust in data sharing, and I developed this together with Mark Ryan. I also did some work on the code of conduct actually with Leanne. But what I'm presenting here is based on the work with my colleague Mark Ryan. So I read the document about OFI, and it's really farmer-centric, and I love it very much. And I like a lot of the presentations here as well, especially about the change of paradigm and the involvement of farmers in design of the tool and the services based on that. So it breathes really participation, and that's what I like a lot about this project. And I think that yeah, we need, well, our task here is to ask the question: are farmers then prepared to share their data? Within a large European project, IOF 2020, we focused specifically on this question, and we did a lot of empirical research around that and used that as a basis to reflect on the code of conduct that has been developed in Europe. So in Europe, the situation is, as Leanne explained also a little bit, it is that yeah, we have legislation regarding the protection of privacy when we share data, but for all other data actually in the European Union, the free flow is being fostered. And the European Commission has thought, well, for these other data, yeah, there are some sensitivities about, for example, farmers' data, and how they're being shared. So let the people, the stakeholders who are already working in the field, let they develop the rules for their own practices, their own data sharing practices. And this resulted actually in the European Code of Conduct for Agricultural Data Sharing by Contractual Agreement. So the idea behind this is that we can shape trust by means of a contract. And of course, we can talk a lot about that, but whether this is sufficient for trust, but we leave that aside for now. But I wanted to say that this code of conduct focuses on the right of the data originator, and that's a bit of an odd term perhaps, but the data originator is the one that commissions others to collect data from their farm or yeah, from a different business, because it also can be other types of businesses like retailers or farm processing industries or input suppliers, etc. So the data originator, so the one who commissions the data collection, should be able to control the use of the data and determine who can have access to it. And the contract should be stated in clear language, of course, which specifies terms and conditions, the purpose of collecting, sharing, and processing data, the rights and obligations that parties have related to data, information on how data are stored, verification mechanisms for the data originator, and transparent mechanisms for adding new and future uses. Well, this is quite challenging, this last bit, of course, because if a company becomes very large and they have a lot of clients who are sharing data with them, then it becomes quite time-consuming to inform everyone as soon as you're going to add a new or future use, and also to ask them for consent for that. Anyway, this code of conduct is based on 5 basic principles. So first of all, it is stated that the data originator is the data owner. So the data originator is able to decide about the data, what happens to the data. So he decides or she decides who has access to these data, who can have control over it, or about data portability. It prescribes to protect data and to provide transparency to the data originator about what is being done with the data. Privacy and security, well, Jan told already something about that. And liability and intellectual property rights, she also told a little bit about that. So I regard this as more as the legal aspects that are included in the code of conduct, which is otherwise, which doesn't have a legal status otherwise. So when we look at the strengths of these of this code of conduct, it says that the strength is that it's a really serious attempt to protect the personal interests, rights, and freedoms of the different people. And of farmers or data originators, which is a slightly broader term. It is shaped by actors in the ecosystem and is therefore supported by them, and it helps to move towards a practical solution, so a contract. So this is this I regard as the strength of the code of conduct. But now we're going to talk about some of its weaknesses. With Mark Ryan, we looked at different codes of conduct that have been developed for different professions through the years. So through the 1990s, you see a proliferation of codes of ethics and codes of conduct intended for different types of professions. And the goal of these codes of conduct or codes of ethics was to avoid business malpractice and misconduct by fostering development of a moral culture within the organization. And through this whole literature, you see that these codes can be very effective, but also that sometimes they are not. And the three principal reasons why they are sometimes not effective is first, because there's a lot of confusion about these codes and about the content, about what they're saying. So codes are often not really clearly formulated. And the second is that codes are not always carefully implemented and administered. And in this case, Liam was mentioning that nobody is actually checking whether there's any uptake of the code of conduct with regard to agricultural data. So that's part of the problem here. And the third is that compliance with a code of conduct depends on alignment with values that are recognized and supported by professionals and employees targeted by the code. And I think in all of these respects, there are critical remarks to be made about the EU Code of Conduct, but here I would like to focus on the third part, on the third criticism, so compliance. If you look at alignment with other codes of ethics and you look at the codes for ICT professionals, then you see that that it's not really aligned. So for example, the ACM Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, there you see that there are more values included than the principles that are part of the EU Code of Conduct. So it says, for example, here on the right, that ICT professionals should contribute to society and to human well-being and should avoid harm, be honest and trustworthy, take action not to discriminate, etc. So be fair is also somewhere there. So actually it's much broader and richer than the EU Code of Conduct. And if we look at the values of agricultural stakeholders, there's also, you also see that they bring forward other values and richer values. So what we did on the basis of a responsible research and innovation approach, we did 22 focus groups and included in total 233 farmers, tech companies and researchers across the EU. And we enhanced reflection there in 3 stages, because if you go to them and you simply ask, what do you think about the data sharing future and what do you want? A lot of people will say, I want to decide by themselves and by myself about the people I share my data with. But when you continue to talk to people then sometimes they come up with alternative data sharing futures. So based on interviews that we had with different stakeholders, we developed different scenarios or different possibilities of how the data sharing future could look like. And we, scenarios or vignettes, because they were really short. So we had the I choose vignette, which said, okay, I want to choose about my own data and I want to choose with whom to share it. But we also had a vignette that was called the data library. So some people brought forward this vignette where data are stored in libraries and policy is developed to govern all data that are part of it. So of course, the image of a library elicits the idea that that everyone could access it and take data out and use them for their own purposes or for public purposes as well. Some people also brought forward the laissez-faire or market vignette, and that means that there will be a kind of market where data are traded. So you can get money for your data, but you can also sell it to other people. And the last one is the value chain vignette. And there people said, I don't mind to share my data, but I just want to do it with my own, with the partners who are part of my own value chain. And we want to do it with blockchain and block everyone else who wants to access our data. So it should just serve our collaboration within the value chain. And you see there that the first two vignettes were actually the preferred ones. And lots of people combined them also in their reasoning. So they wanted a kind of library, but they also wanted to keep the I choose liberty. So, and within their reflections, they brought forward various values. So they brought forward autonomy and transparency. So here you see a few quotes by farmers. So people said, well, I think the farmers are going to want to make the I choose model the default because they just don't trust the system. So this is an example of somebody who says, I want to have it in my power to choose. But lots of people also had doubt about whether contracts always serve autonomy. So some people felt pushed towards making a choice. Some people said it's difficult to understand the information that is provided, but also the tech providers said it's difficult to provide the adequate information that people are able to understand, especially if you have a lot of clients. There's also unclarity about who is to decide about what data. So if you sign a contract, is this only about the raw data? Or are you actually also controlling the data after they are processed, combined with different data and interpreted? Because after that, after the first stage, it's very often quite difficult to trace the data and to see what happens to them. So it's also important to talk about the limitations of what you can decide about.
Sorry, excuse me, Simone, but we are also a little bit over the time.
Oh, sorry, I can't see you.
You're passionate, like Leon.
I will just say, well, it's also about fairness that they consider important, and they considered care for the commons very important and wanted to be included in the development of rules for data sharing. So there you see the differences between the values that are brought forward by the EU Code of Conduct and by the stakeholders. So you see a kind of mismatch, and that is the conclusion. Yeah, well, it says that the code of conduct then needs enrichment in order to have better alignment with the values of the stakeholder, and that careful considerations should go into how the code is being implemented and administered, because there's not a lot of uptake, and the language of the code should be clear and concise, because a lot of people don't understand what is in there. And that's it. Sorry to be too long.